Today, has Australia lost its way between US and China? Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Well, latest post covering finance and property news. This is my edit of a recent discussion that I had with Adam Stokes over on his channel as we discussed the whole question of trade and China and the US and Australia's position in that matrix. And we went deep and wide into some of the underlying issues which are potentially affecting the way that Australia sees itself and the way it interacts internationally. And we draw some conclusions about the nature of democracy in Australia and a couple of other philosophical issues too. So enjoy.
G'day viewers, I'm Adam Stokes. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're doing something a little bit different. We're diving back into the political space to see where we stand in Australia, what's happening in the world around us with the multipolar relationship between different nations, how we're working together, if we need to work together, who's benefiting from what relationships, what risks are ahead. And of course, I've brought in our philosopher, our expert in this space, and much loved friend and member of this community, Martin North. Welcome to the show.
Hello, nice to be back again. Boy, this is a really, really important conversation. And just remind everybody, 96 years ago on this day was the Great Crash.
Wow, I didn't know that. That what we're talking about the Depression?
1929 Wall Street crash. It was right at the end of October.
There you go. Okay, well, in crypto, of course, things aren't looking so crash hot, even though we had an interest rate cut and we had some good talks with China and America. So who knows what's happening in this world? And it sets the stage, I think, very importantly for what we're getting into tonight, Martin. So as you know, and as we discussed before we went live, we had this relationship, finally, this meeting, I should say, on a long-standing relationship between Australia and America. But in the bigger picture, we're looking at America and all of the nations around the world. But Prime Minister Albanese went finally to see the President of the United States, and it appeared on the surface that things went really well. There are a lot of questions about who won what, like who got the benefit out of the meeting, who's getting the benefit out of the relationship. But before we dive into that, Martin, I want to step back. I want to set the stage and understand in a historical and even diplomatic and economic context, why is the world so integrated? Does it need to be so integrated? And once we establish this, I'll talk about how Australia plays its role in this multipolar world. So what's the story with the relationship with America and the rest of the world?
So I think you need to go back into history a little bit. And, I could go a long way back, but let's go back post the Second World War, because after that, essentially, we had the coalition of the West willing, who basically saw off Germany and put a very strong process in to try and rebuild Europe. But quite clearly and quickly, it became a Western philosophy, capitalist, versus Eastern philosophy, communist. Right? And we have this clear delineation for several decades, West good, Russia bad, communism bad, and of course we had the Reds under the beds in the US and all those things. And so it was quite simple for countries who were sort of orbiting around this sort of coalesce on one side of the fence or the other. And of course, not surprisingly, the UK and Australia and most of Western Europe all coalesced around the stronger than ever US. And of course, the US then created a whole bunch of structures, including financial structures and even economic structures through the UN and all those things. It's funny that the UN is in New York, right? So basically there was this idea that, US equals UN equals good. And then they basically talked about the growing trade relationships and, getting international trade to work better and better and all those things. And that was sort of relatively stable for a period of time. Although actually in practice, what then started to happen was we had other countries beginning to climb up the economic ladder. And because of the fact that the thread there was towards more globalization rather than less, we actually started seeing industries within the US and in the UK and in Australia begin to disappear because it was cheaper for other countries in other places, be it in Asia or wherever, to actually make stuff and sell it back. And so we actually had, as part of this globalization, a hollowing out of individual elements of the economy, individual locations. Think of the Rust Belt in the US. And that hollowing out and the globalization started then to create some other forces. So we started to see not just Russia, and of course Russia fell apart, and so that was part of the the 70s and the 80s. But we started to see the rise of China and India, and so we started to see other nations begin to play this game of, we can build cheaper than you, we'll sell you stuff. We'll buy raw materials and we'll actually sell it back to you. And of course, that was the mode of operation for quite a long period of time. And in fact, through that period, I would suggest to you that the US screwed up pretty majorly, because they basically got to the point where they were ending up saying, well, we'll just be reliant. Or in Europe, we got very reliant on Russian gas, for example, Russian oil. And then, of course, we had the Ukraine situation. We had China coming up and starting to grow and expand and become what I called a deadly embrace between the US and China. And there was a dependency being built then, particularly US on China, but also other countries. So what we started to see then was this idea that, well, hang on a moment, this globalization picture, who's winning and who's losing? Because actually what it ended up with was that some of that wealth transference went from the US and other Western countries to these other countries, allowed them to grow and develop. And now we've got the situation where, and China is a good example, China is now the second largest economy in the world, but is still the manufacturing hub for a lot of stuff. And now, late in the day, in the US, there's been an attempt to say, hang on a moment, maybe that's not the right game to play. Maybe we should think about changing it. And that's where the tariff conversation comes in, et cetera, et cetera. But we still have in the US a lot of people who still have this old world, new world, East versus West. West is great, East is not, China bad, US good. That sort of simplistic thinking. But what we've really got now is a proliferation of different centers of gravities and different relationships. We've got the BRICS relationships, which effectively is led by China, but also with other countries too. And you've got even some countries who are in a fully both camps. So some countries in the Middle East, some countries in Asia are actually in both the BRICS and in relationships with the US. So if you actually stand back, BRICS is now bigger than that Western alignment in some measures. And so it's fascinating that we've got this now very different world. And we got, I call it the multipolar world, because it's not simplistically us and them, good and bad anymore. It's a much, much more complex set of relationships. Now, that's the context for understanding the evolution of what happened then with Australia over the last few years, because, of course, if you go back, it was pretty simple. US good. Right, we need to be part of that US orbit. And, of course, Australia has a very, very strong and enduring relationship with the US. And, if you listen carefully to most people who are in Australia, they will say, oh, no, US is the way we want to be aligned, despite the fact that our biggest trading partner is now China. So what I'm trying to highlight here is that we've got a world of much greater complexity now. We've got the Trump story with tariffs. We've got I want to invest back in the US, put money into the US, and that's good. So we've got this massive now structural shift going on the other way. And we've got, of course, people like the UN still talking about globalization and how globalization is good. My perspective is globalization has not necessarily been good for many people. It's been good for a few people. It's been good for the rich people. It's been good for some of the Western countries, and it's been very good for some of those emerging countries. But has it delivered? Probably not. Will it deliver? No, probably won't. And this is the real question. And this is where I come to when you actually think about international relationships, and I'm sitting in Australia thinking, who am I going to dance with? You can't just pick one dance partner. You've actually got to pick multiple dance partners, and you've got to have a much more sophisticated game. And my fundamental view is that Australia is not up to it in terms of negotiating that complexity, which is what we saw in recent times. I can't hear your audio.
Have you got me now?
Yep.
I knew when I asked that question, it's going to take me down many different rabbit holes. And the issue I battle with myself. So I think about what's the most important thing to Australia? That is it security? And many people believe, wrongly or rightly, and I don't have the answer, is that the reason why we have such a close relationship with the United States is because they're the biggest military in the world, and we need their military to protect us from bad people. But then, as you rightly say, well, our biggest trade partner isn't the United States. Sure, we buy a lot of planes, as Trump reminded us during the meeting with Albo. That's why we've got a surplus. Well, first of all, we're a very small country. We could have... we could be producing a lot more in the sense that we could be making a lot more profits out of the stuff out of our ground. But we'll get to that. There's a lot to unpack here. Yeah. So we look about what's the most important thing to Australia. Now, is it looking after our own people? Well, I don't think so. I would like to think it is, but you can see that the cost of living is through the roof here. We can see that we give away most of our resources whilst we're going poor. And when I say give away, it's cheaper to buy Australian energy abroad than Australian energy in Australia. Senator Roberts made that very clear, and the data shows that. So that's nothing controversial to say there. Then we look at alliance with the United States. Well, it took so long for our leader to speak to the new leader, that is Albanese, to speak with Trump. Historically, I think those meetings happen a lot sooner. But then we say, well, what's the most important thing to Australia? Is it ourselves? Well, no, we seem to sell ourselves out. Well, is it the military alliance? Well, maybe, but who are we defending ourselves against when our biggest trading partner is China? And we're told that that's who we're defending ourselves against. So I just seek the truth, Martin. I've got more questions than answers. What is the most important thing in your mind to the Australian political leadership, and what should be the most important thing to the Australian political leadership?
Well, come back a step. And by the way, you're stuttering, I notice. I don't know whether you've got other apps in the background running, but you're stuttering at the moment, both on the live YouTube.
Thank you. I'll clean it up.
Yeah.
Damn it. Yep.
So the question you've got to ask yourself is, what is the Australian economy for? That's actually the first place to start, right? And depending on the answer to that, will give you a bunch of different answers as to where you go next. What I mean by that is, if you believe that the Australian economy is about maximizing the benefits to and life of the people who live in Australia, then that's one thing. If you believe that the Australian economy is about maximizing the GDP, so it's a financial metric, then you go somewhere different. If you think that the purpose of the Australian economy is to be an outpost in Asia for the US, then you'd have a different answer to that question about what is the Australian economy for. Now, I fundamentally have always believed the Australian economy is about maximizing the benefit to the Australian people. And what that means is both in terms of financial, but also lifestyle, and security, all of those things. And so what that essentially says is that if you don't pass muster on, are we actually improving as a society? So what are the societal norms? If we're not improving in terms of the GDP per capita, I have a problem. And if we end up with a narrowing of the economic base, which is what we've had in recent times, it means that we are less able to sustain ourselves into the future. That's all where we are at the moment. So I would argue that the bets that have been made by politicians and the Treasury and even big business in the recent times has not been to maximize the benefits to ordinary Australians. There's another agenda here. And frankly, unless that changes, we're going to dig a deeper and deeper hole for ourselves. We're going to create a bigger and bigger military target if China gets angry with us, as it's possible they will if we go on the route we're on. And in the meantime, more and more of the wealth that was generated by Australian resources is being sold offshore cheap. We're not generating sufficient tax income from that, which means that Australians are paying more and more for less and less, and that's why real standards of living continue to degrade. So that's the sort of the nutshell story here. Fundamental question is, what do you think the Australian economy is for?
Well, I would hope, as you said, that it should be for us. It should. I'll give an example. So in other nations, when you look at the Middle Eastern nations, as an example, Qatar, and I'll go to the UAE in a second, but we'll go to Qatar first. Qatar is a small nation, but very gas resource rich. And it gives each of its citizens, there's about a population of 1 million people in Qatar, certainly when I lived there. Now there's about, of that 1 million, 300,000 are actually Qataris. And they all get a block of land for free. They don't pay rates because it's their land, they're Qataris. And at one stage, they weren't paying for electricity or water because the amount of revenue that their gas reserves were making for their very small population meant that they didn't need to pay for it. They shared the wealth, as in the government, the nation, shared the wealth with its people. In the Middle East, in the UAE, it's something similar along those lines, where the government seems to... I interviewed a guy called Adam Hudson, and it was very powerful. I'm telling his story. He spoke to someone, an Emirati, who said, you know, what do you think about... Adam was speaking to an Emirati and said, how do you look at your government? And he basically said, we look at our government as like our parent who loves us and cares for us, and our government wants the best for us. And Adam Hudson was blown away, and I was blown away. I'm like, wow, governments actually care about you? And when I interviewed Senator Hudson, sorry for all this name dropping, but I'm trying to build a picture here. Senator Roberts, rather. Senator Roberts made it very clear when I asked him the question. I said, hey, Senator, in a much more formal manner, I said, does the government hate us? And without batting an eyelid, he immediately responded, the government doesn't care about you. And I'm like, oh. Yeah. And then you look into veteran suicide, how veterans are treated. And, you know, there was a Royal Commission into veteran suicide. So it's not just an opinion. You can see it went to the level that, hey, we need a Royal Commission, into the reality that it is more dangerous for a veteran. This is a matter of fact. It is more dangerous for a veteran to return to Australia than it is to go and face the enemy in war. They are more likely to die returning home than they are facing the enemy in battle. Then we expand that to so many other facets, as I was talking about, with the cost of living, accommodation, energy, food. It's cheaper to buy our stuff overseas than it is to buy it here. So then I ask many people is, who's in charge? So if the government's in charge, why don't they care about us? And if they don't care about us, why are they in charge? But then we actually unpack it and you say, well, who is in charge? So now we look at the WEF and the World Economic Forum's agenda. Who's in charge? Who's benefiting from this? In your opinion, two-part question. Who's in charge of Australia? Who's in charge of the world?
Well, that's quite an interesting question. And of course, there are people who think that there is this sort of dark shibboleth somewhere behind the scenes. There's this group who are pulling all the levers and, you know, what have you. I'm a little bit unconvinced by that. I think it's more about the philosophies that have driven particular outcomes. And those philosophies are making wealth is good, making more wealth is better. Big corporations is good, bigger corporations is better. I mean, that's really effectively what's been driving a lot of this. And if you ask the question, who's in charge in Australia, it's the big corporations. It's the big banks. It's the big mining companies. It's the big gas companies. They have a much more powerful influence on policy, directly and indirectly, than ordinary Australians do, despite the fact that it's ordinary Australians who elect the politicians. I also said, of course, it doesn't matter which party you elect. Both of the big parties have the same 90% at least the same policies, and two cheeks of the same bum, to quote the famous phrase, right? It doesn't make any much difference who you vote for, because effectively they are all under the gun of those big corporates. Now, those big corporates don't live necessarily in Australia. Many of them are actually international corporations. And if you look at the size of some of them, I mean, NVIDIA, for example, 5 trillion cap. makes Nvidia bigger than the total UK economy, just to give you a comparison, right? And, the US economy, big, UK economy, quite big, Australian economy, very, very small. So the power of these large multinational organizations, unfortunately, a lot of them are directly connected, for example, through to the Davos connection and the World Economic Forum and the technocrats there, who have a very strong vision of the future, which is effectively a future enabled by a particular set of technologies and, digital and all of those things, but effectively, hunkering down on emissions and those sorts of things, and effectively defining a future where you have much less control. You'll own nothing and be happy, that sort of idea. Now, that is the sort of the thematic that comes through. Interestingly, a lot of politicians, of course, have had influence from the World Economic Forum directly and indirectly. And so some of the ideas that you see percolating down into Australia are coming directly from those unelected representatives in the World Economic Forum or the UN and those other entities, many of whom have very strong alignment to the US philosophies and approaches. And I see you've put the market caps up there. Just, it is astonishing to look at that. And by the way, they are going to spend another 80 billion over the next year in capex spending to further drive the AI investment, or shall I say the AI Ponzi further. Now, I mentioned the 1929 crash, right? We are approaching, I think, a similar thing again, because the same hyper story is going on as when happened up to the 29 cat crash, and the same trends are happening. So we're not really in a stable world. The amount of investment in AI is abhorrent, and I don't believe that a lot of it will actually be an investment that will pay. And I will say, if it does pay, it will pay with less jobs, because of course it'll be automated away, or you'll have millions of data centers or hundreds of data centers with millions of chips in them that will be depreciated very quickly, and that'll be written off against tax, of course, which means that taxpayers pay as well. So I'm afraid it's a complex situation, but I do think the story ultimately is who's in charge? It's the big corporations.
And so who owns the corporations then? That is it the shareholders? So as you saw, you were talking about NVIDIA. You've got these publicly listed companies, and they're making, like NVIDIA, over $5 trillion. It's a record for any company in human history. No company in human history has had a $5 trillion market cap. And it's up 3% just today, Martin.
I know.
Just today. 3% on top of
it's paper. It's paper money. It's not real.
Well, what's also interesting about NVIDIA, most people think NVIDIA makes the chips. They don't. They actually have the IP. It's
Correct.
TSMC who makes the chips.
Correct.
So, I was talking about this just last night on the show about Taiwan. And of course, there's push to make these chips in the States, but the corporate knowledge of what's in Taiwan and the infrastructure in Taiwan is second to none, and you can't replicate it overnight. Now, the second biggest chip manufacturer is Samsung, but they don't do anything near to the quality or quantity of what TSMC can do with the IP of NVIDIA behind it. But moving further from there, when it comes to war, and we'll bring it back to what Australia and America, we'll narrow it in to Australia and America shortly, but I still want to stay on the global stage for now. I've often said on this channel that I believe war is coming, and you've got artificial intelligence, of course, is the front foot of everything. It's almost like an arms race now. So I see this arms race in the past of, if you think about the Cold War, it was a militaristic arms race. Then we went into this financial battle that I think we're in now. I mean, there was many transitions, but I'm going to fast forward a fair bit when we go into what's going to be the global reserve currency. The US dollar, which it is right now, that's just crossed $38 trillion in debt, with more than $1 trillion in interest payments on that debt, more than their military every year, debt on debt on debt, printing more debt to pay the debt on the debt, which will bring more debt. Then you've got BRICS that's rising and saying, well, hang on a second, we don't like buying your fake money, so you can pay us interest with more fake money for our real labor. And by the way, we also don't like that you've weaponized your dollar, wrongly or rightly, if we don't do what you tell us without any court or right of appeal, if you will. You just cut us out of the SWIFT network. You call us oligarchs. You call us terrorists. You seize our bank accounts, and we can't play in that system anymore. And of course, that's what happened with Russia. Again, it's not about right or wrong. It's about the world saw that if you piss off America, you're out of the financial system. So you've got this sinking fiat fake money. You've got the politics behind it, or the weaponization of the dollar. So then you've got a rising currency, which is BRICS, that I personally don't think will work. You've got the old yellow rock that everyone says, well, it's going to go to this, which is a terrible medium of exchange. Then you've got the neutral party, that is Bitcoin. So you've got this arms race of the money sector at the moment. But of course, you've now spoken about artificial intelligence, and there's two parts, in my opinion, with the artificial arms race that we're facing around the world. So you've got the actual development itself, the development of the software and hardware in the background, programming and prompting AI even to teach itself. That's an arms race in itself. And the second part of this first part, if you will, is of course the hardware to back it up. Okay. Now we go into the second part of the artificial intelligence arms race, and that is energy. You need huge amounts of energy to run these processes, just to build it and to run it. So I now see this arms race all around the world. And again, I seek your guidance on it. We've got a kinetic arms race where Trump is saying, hey, we need you to spend more money on your military. We've got an economic or a fiscal arms race of economies and the dollar, or the currency, the money that is moved between these nations. Then you've got the artificial arms race, which, as I mentioned, there's two parts, the development of it in itself and the energy to power it. Where does it end? Is there a tipping point? Will it achieve world peace, or are you concerned?
I don't think it will achieve world peace. What I would say is that the amount of energy that is projected to be required to power the data centers means that the chances of actually getting reductions in emissions is close to zero, if you actually go down that route. But more importantly, there will be more data centers built, or are being built, than probably will ever get used. And the analogy I use is back in the dot-com bubble, just before the it crashed. A lot of big telcos invested really, really big in dark fiber. So they laid massive amounts of fiber, and there was huge capital spend on fiber for a few years until the dot-com bubble crashed. And a lot of telcos were the ones who got caught in the crossfire. And that means essentially is that, you can spend big on the hope, but, was there a report that said something like 80 or 90% of AI projects failed to deliver any productivity gains? Something like that, I think I saw recently. And like I said, if you actually get to the point where AI replaces real jobs for real people, how's that going to improve productivity? So from all sorts of perspectives, this is a bubble built on a bubble. And of course, just the interrelationship between the AI producers and the hyperscalers, and how they're investing and cross-investing in each other. That's exactly like the global financial crisis in 2008. That was in the property market. This is in the AI market. So I don't see much prospects here of a better future. I do see many of these entrepreneurs getting hugely, hugely wealthy on the back of everybody else. But if you think about what this means in terms of the final outcome, it's not necessarily positive for ordinary people. I come back to, what's an economy for, right? I don't think an economy is just to enable corporations to get bigger and to enable those executives to make more and more money. Now, I'm old-fashioned here, right? I don't think just making more money for the sake of it is actually necessarily goodness. I think there are other moral standards and moral outcomes that are much better. And I come back to the ordinary question of, are ordinary citizens in the US or Australia better off today than they were 10 years ago? No. If you look at consumer confidence levels, they're low. If you look at what people are spending their money on, they pay more tax, and they've got less disposable income than they had a decade ago. And the trajectory is continuing to degrade. And by the way, the average expectation of life, which was growing quite strongly, is beginning to turn the other way now. So, if you measure it just in terms of longevity of good life, then that's a problem. And by the way, I'd also add that things like all the chemicals that are floating around the environment and the other things that we've done to our broader environment is making the environment itself more and more toxic. So if you think about it, there are so many things heading in the wrong direction rather than the right direction. So that's my concern. And, House of Cards, well, that's exactly right. I do think it's a bit of a Jenga, right? It'll go up and up and up, but it's getting more and more wobbly. And more of the growth in the US economy over the last year or two has just been in the AI segment. If you strip out the AI stocks, which is something like 30% of the stock market, and look at the returns in the rest of the market, they're sideways or down. So you've got a narrow base. It's a big base, but it's a narrow base in terms of what it's doing. Now, if that goes pop for any reason, that's a big problem. And I'm very interested, of course, that Trump, when he was over in Asia, has now agreed to allow China to take some of the more sophisticated chips, whereas previously he'd actually stopped them. And in return, China's saying, well, you can have some rare earths for another year or so. But that was because otherwise China would have just gone on and created their own chips anyway. So it's a zero-sum game in my view. But we've got to get this in a different perspective. I do come back to 1929, right? 1929 was created by a massive overinvestment in a range of technologies at the time, a massive amount of speculation on the idea of get rich quick, such that everybody wanted to get rich quick. And then it all fell over. And I do think there are very strong analogies between then and now.
Well, we had that. You're looking at footage now from Al Jazeera with the discussions of Trump and Xi, and of course he was pushing for fentanyl to stop coming from China into America, and you're looking at footage of these boats being blown out of the water. But there's obviously a lot going on there between China and America, and it's quite fascinating because they're apparently enemies, but they need each other. And it's this globalization of where we are now, that we are all so interconnected that even if we don't like each other, we really need each other. Yeah. And of course, in Australia, we've got this huge issue of houses are so bloody expensive because we've monetized what should be a home market. It's now really a financial market if you want to keep it real. The housing market isn't about homes, it's about money because there's no shortage of land. And we're all competing for a home some are competing for a home to actually live in, and others are competing for houses to park their money somewhere. And of course, with all the tax breaks and so forth. But I want to bring it back to Australia now on the global stage.
Yep. So
Trump and Albanese met recently. And I would suggest it was certainly in my perception, not that I was there, but I can only see what I saw, the comments made by Trump to the Australian ambassador was very awkward. And if you look at the history about what Kevin Rudd has said about Trump publicly, I actually don't blame Trump for his response to the Australian ambassador. And yeah. I also think that having been in a liaison role myself on the local and global stage, relationships are absolutely crucial. Absolutely crucial. And in my opinion, if you've got the leader of the free world who's openly said, I don't like you, I don't think I'll ever like you, and equally the ambassador has said Trump is bad and he's a danger to the world, I think it's a very, very bad situation where you've got these two men that are forced to work either symbiotically or symbolically, what's the word, as a symbolism of the relationship between Australia and America, where they're going to work in a diplomatic role, where they're working together. That needs to be, in my opinion, reassessed. But when we advance a little bit forward to Albanese and Trump, we can see that the relationship, in my opinion, was very slow forming. In all the time that I've been worked for government in the past, and all the time that I've seen the relationships between Australia and America, in my observation and in my opinion, the relationships between the Australian leader and the American leader, whichever party was in power at the time, seemed to be much closer, and it seemed to move a lot quicker. In this instance, it seems to have moved a lot slower, and it seems to be more abrasive. In your opinion, was the meeting that took place between Trump and Albanese, was it genuine, as in they both said, hey, it went really well? Did it really happen well? And a part B to that, and I'm sorry to have two-part questions here, did it go well? And who benefited the most from that meeting?
Did it go well is interesting. Did you see the, I'm going to put this up for you. You see this? This Albanese, the Trump whisperer. Well, you can see it, it's back to front, but
see it. I can see it.
Yeah. Okay. That's pretty amazing, right? So that was the way that the media actually showed the results. So they believed that Albo got Trump's measure, etc., etc. Although actually, I think this one probably is a better way to show it, right? You've got Rudd with his head on the plate, right? Well, that went better than I expected, but the best summary of what happened was this one from Kathy Wilcox, right? And I just want to read this because it's really, really interesting. So they get considerable control over our critical minerals sector. Yep. Ensuring that we can keep paying them billions for submarines we may never get. That's right. And we could ignore their slide into a fascistic autocracy with no regard for the rule of law. Astonishing. People often underestimate me. That is the best summary that I think I saw of this. This was smoke and mirrors. This was not effectively in the interests of Australia so much as in the interests of the US. The US got a lot. Australia got very little. And as a result of that, and we can go into that in a bit more detail in a second, we can look at things like the discussion around AUKUS. We can look at the superannuation promise, and we can look at the rare earths promise. But the point was, Albo had to come out smelling of roses, and so basically he was able to position appropriately. But no, this wasn't actually necessarily to the benefit of Australia or Australians. And it's fascinating to me how the sycophantic media in Australia just played it up as perfection. And I think Kathy Wilcox was actually the only one that I saw that really summarized it perfectly for me.
Well, that's concerning. I was hoping you were going to give me a more positive spin there, because it appeared to me that if you look at the body language, in fact, there was this whole video on the body language of Trump versus Albanese during the meeting, and it was clear to this assessor that Albanese was very submissive to Trump, and maybe there's reason for that because it's a superpower against little old Australia. But as I mentioned before, as I was tripping over my words, the relationship between Australia and America used to be so close. It used to be so tight. We used to be great mates. Now, I've served on operations with Americans, and there seems to be a great deal of respect between the two nations. I've also had the opportunity to study in America, even part of the ROTC, the Reserve Officer Training Corps, with the United States Army. And there was a deep respect, but in my first-hand opinion and experience, there was a deep respect between America and Australia. Over time, though, if you look at what the ABC did, my tax dollars had to do. My tax dollars had to fund a 4-part series on Four Corners some time ago against Donald Trump. It was a slur campaign against our friend. Now, whether we like Trump or not, that's irrelevant. What is relevant is that I would suggest that we should like America. And historically, we have liked America. And yet our tax dollars are going to the ABC to fund a slur campaign against a democratically elected leader of our closest and arguably, depends who you ask, and which angle we take it, our most important ally. And then recently we've done the same thing again. First of all, what Four Corners did was, in my observation, in my opinion, is that they blatantly lied by saying Trump colluded with Russia. There is still absolutely no proof of that whatsoever. And yet we had to fund a slur campaign against the leader of our friend. And then just recently they've done the same thing to the extent that they say, well, Trump's bad because he's building all these buildings from all the money that he's making as the president of the United States. And it's like, well, he was making buildings before he was the president of the United States. He was a billionaire before he was the president of the United States. And I'm sure there's some perks for being the president of the United States. But in my observation, the article that they made is like, well, he's now making money because he's the president in these buildings. And he's like, No, he was always a property tycoon, even before he got into politics, well before that. So what I see is that we've got this very weird relationship with America where the taxpayer-funded media is constantly harassing and attacking and belittling the leader of our friend. But at the same time, you've got a leftist politician going forward and being very nice and civilized, while the other leftist ambassador, it was openly slurring and slandering the President of the United States, resulting in the President of the United States saying, I don't like you and I'll never like you either. And then, as you've said, and then that illustration was great, they've come back and they said, wow, look at us, we did such a good job. And it's like, are you really doing a good job? Because the relationship, in my opinion, doesn't look that good. But equally, when we go into the economics of it, I don't think we came into that deal fiscally in a beneficial position. As you summarised very articulately there, is that, well, it looks like that we're paying billions of dollars for subs, and I think those subs are very important. We're surrounded by a lot of water, and subs have an incredible strategic and tactical capability. But when it comes to will they actually be delivered, well, that's not certain. And when it comes to, I want to now move into the superannuation funds. As I understand it, and maybe you can provide some clarity on this, when it comes to the billions, perhaps $1 trillion in superannuation funds that's sitting there, there was a report I listened to where they said, right, well done. We're now giving America, to an extent, access to our superannuation funds, which they're going to then invest into drill, baby, drill. And I thought it was so powerful, this article, because it was saying, well, the left is all about the green policy. You know, we're going to have no energy here in Australia. What we're going to do is we're going to sell all of our energy for other people to build, to use. We're going to dig coal out of the ground. And we're going to say we have the moral high ground by being green. We're not going to burn our own energy. So what we're going to do is we're going to dig all the coal out of our ground. We're going to put it on gas-guzzling cargo ships, and we're going to go sell it to everyone else. And then they can go burn our coal, and then they can have cheap energy. And what we're going to do is we're going to tear our land to pieces by ripping it all up to have solar farms and windmill farms, and we're going to kill birds and poison waterways. But we're going to stand back and we say we have the moral high ground, because we're about renewable energy, whilst at the same time, we're selling all of our fossil fuel to other countries to burn. So the carbon's still going into the air. But the next step to this, Martin, is apparently, and again, I seek your guidance on this, the $1 trillion allegedly of access they have to our super funds is now going to America, where apparently they're going to invest a lot of that money into drill, baby, drill and fossil fuels. Your thoughts?
Well, just start by saying, who owns the superannuation funds, right? The government doesn't own the superannuation funds. This article here makes the point, right? Albanese accused of using superannuation as a bargaining chip during talks with Donald Trump. Australian super funds will invest 1.44 trillion US dollars, that's 2.2 trillion Aussie dollars, in the US by 2035. That's another trillion above current levels. The statement credited Trump with creating tens of thousands of high-paying American jobs, casting it in with Australia as a political victory. And the Prime Minister appeared to support the framing, later calling Australia's $4.2 trillion superannuation pool a significant resource that we want to use. Now, that is a big deal. Albanese got played, former Liberal MP Craig Kelly said. Chalmers, in the last day or two, has said he wants to direct superannuation to housing in Australia as well. So let's just be clear. Your savings, the ones that you are being forced to make within the superannuation system, those superannuation systems that are charging 30 billion each year for fees and is accumulating, 4+ trillion of funds, they are actually wanting to use your money. Now, as a superannuation holder, surely you should have some say in that. It shouldn't just be seen as government money for them to direct as they wish. That is a fundamental flaw. And I really am concerned about the fact that Chalmers and Albo are talking about using our money for their objectives. That is disgraceful. And nobody seems to want to talk about it. But to me, that's a really important point, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not their money. It's our money. Surely it's for us to talk about where we want to invest it. And will the superannuation funds, who are there to maximize the returns, invest in X versus Y if X happens to be what the government wants, but Y is a better return? Doesn't that put them in a period of conflict as well? This is a disgrace.
It's like we've actually been speaking about it for a long time in the political and economic space, that it's this big honeypot that the government wants to access. And of course, when the first line of accessing it was taxing it. All right, we're going to force you to pay into this fund, okay, and then we're going to tax you before you even cash out on it.
Just want to show you this. Yeah, Chalmers taps super to net billions for Labor priorities. Chalmers signalled plans to unlock Australia's 4.3 trillion superannuation bill to boost investment in areas such as housing and clean energy projects, right? So your superannuation is going to direct it into clean energy projects, whether you like it or not.
But that 1,000 billion, that trillion that we were referring to before, that's going to America, that's going to be ploughed into drill, baby, drill. That's going to be ploughed into, allegedly. And again, I seek the truth here. So we go broke, our energy bills go up, we destroy our land, we kill the birds, pollute the waterways. And if you're wondering what I mean by polluting the waterways, if you look into how when solar panels break down, the stuff that they leach into the earth is horrific. Yep. And I was talking to a friend about it. They go, but what, they built it by rivers? And it's like, no, some they do, but rain flows somewhere. Like it eventually goes into waterways. And that's why waterways are so precious. And of course, windmills, there's so many studies about, well, first of all, they've got a relatively short life. Second of all, you've got to dig up all the ground to run all the power lines,
the base that those windmills require in terms of the concrete. You have to go down a long way. You have to put a load of steel in there. That is hardly environmentally friendly on the way in, right? So.
Yeah, and just absolutely tearing the earth to pieces. Like it just seems so weird to me because it's like we care about the environment, and yet we are literally destroying Australia, tearing it to pieces to put in a very short-term solution. And again, I've said this to the Senator, and I've said it to you, and I'll say it again. It would carry some substance if the Australian government and everyone said, right, all that coal in the ground, no one can touch it. And it's like, well, at least they're putting their money where their mouth is. At least they're saying, right, we're serious about not burning this stuff, so no one can touch it. But they don't do that. They dig it up and they sell it to other countries and they burn it so that it's still going into the atmosphere whilst we're going poor and we're destroying our world. As in our Australian world here, we are destroying the habitat of so many innocent creatures. You know, I'm an animal lover, as you are. I've got Dino under my feet here, and I know you've probably got your dogs next to you, but it's so much more than just our pets. It's our landscape. But before I go down that rabbit, there they are. There's Doggy Cam. Looking here. Dino's under my feet. He's passed out. Going back to the relationship between Australia and America. So in the big picture, that in your mind, just to clarify before we move on to some defense stuff, America benefited way more than Australia from that meeting.
Yeah. So 3 points. Firstly, it amazes me that Albo can talk about our superannuation as their money to invest, right? And secondly, then to leverage it into the US. And of course, the US doesn't understand where the superannuation came from, but it was a big number, right? And that was the critical point. Albo had to show it was a big number, and he was able to do that. And that was one of the reasons why he got some brownie points. And then third, the practicalities of doing this, like I said, the individual superannuation funds have a remit to maximize their returns. So the question I have is, what happens if effectively the mandate from government is that you're going to invest your superannuation in stuff that actually doesn't pay back as well? How does that work? And nobody's thought that through. So the consequences of that decision cuts to the heart of the inefficient and stupid superannuation system that was brought in a long time ago with one end intended. It's now morphed into something where a lot of people investing, for their future rather than actually just for retirement. And in the meantime, it's all those big financial corporates who are making a lot of money out of this. And the government now, there's such a large pool there that it's itching to be used. So, yeah, Albo used it as a leverage tool in that conversation with Trump to ingratiate himself with Trump. It was a big number, but the consequences, boy, that's a question.
Who should we side closer to, in your opinion? So you're the Prime Minister, thought experiment, you're the Prime Minister of Australia tomorrow, and you've got the majority of the House, and you've got loyal followers behind you, so you can make powerful decisions. Do we align closer to China or America?
It's not a question of aligning to one or the other. We need both. We need our own policy of international relations, which means essentially making sure that we can build our own manufacturing base in Australia. So step one, you've got to deal with the energy cost problem, right? The truth is that energy will continue to rise. The most recent projections are that energy costs in Australia will continue to rise. And that's partly because of the renewals phase that we're going through. But it's predominantly because those big corporations are milking us. They are actually taking the cheap gas out of the ground and selling it on international markets and then providing effectively it back to us effectively at international rates rather than actually what it should be at local rates. That was bad policy from a few years ago, and it's absolutely stuffed Australia. That's why the CPI was so high this last time around. It was high energy costs. We have to get energy costs down. That's the first thing to do. And that means we need to look very seriously about the way that we're actually dealing with this. But those big energy companies, they're not Australian based, they're international based. And so there is this worry that if we start reserving gas for local use, then that could actually maybe affect our credit rating or all of those things. No, you've got to do this. So that's the first point. Second point, you've got to actually be smart in the way that you manage these international relationships and have relationships with both China and the US. They're both very important partners for us in different ways. And we need to actually be smart, not just like when we did our original agreement with China, where we said, oh yeah, we'll just throw you all our raw materials. You can do all the processing. We'll just throw you the raw materials. No. We have to be doing processing and value add in Australia. Unfortunately, the rare earth agreement with the US looks to me as though it's precisely the same. We're going to dig up rare earths. And by the way, rare doesn't mean that it's not much around. It's just hard to get. That's what rare earth means. Those rare earth minerals are actually available in Australia, but we should be processing them in Australia. We should be investing in that. We can't do that unless we get energy right. So there's a follow-on conversation. And then the third one is on a defense perspective. We need to have our own facilities, sure, and we need to be actually connected to those broader defense capabilities that the US probably has. But that doesn't mean that we should be opening the door to allow the US more and more to come and effectively put their bases all around the place and what have you, because that can create a bigger target vis-a-vis China. So we have to be more sophisticated in this thinking rather than just saying, yeah, come on, US, we'll build you a base in Western Australia and you can bring those subs down and what have you, right? We're just not sophisticated enough to deal with this. And that's my problem. I'm afraid that we are still dealing with politicians and diplomats who are living in that pre-defined world that I started with of Western versus the rest, good versus bad. No, the world is not like that anymore. We're in a multipolar world, and we need a much more sophisticated approach to international relations than we currently are deploying.
Isn't that we're so bad at negotiating? Really, are Australians that bad at contract negotiation? Or is it that we're just happy to sell ourselves out? Which one is it? Are we stupid?
Short-termism, right?
So no loyalty to the country?
No.
I know you and I have referred to this book before, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And what was so striking in that book, of all the books I've read, that's the one I keep referring to so much. And it's because there's a line in that book where he talks about those at the top, whoever's running it, there's no loyalty to their nation or a party. So I understand that there's no loyalty to a party, but I at least always thought that there was loyalty to a nation. But you can see at the top that there's no loyalty to anything except really themselves. And it's very scary to me because, you know, you'll sell out your party, you'll sell out your nation, you'll even sell out your religion to an extent, where it's just like, just show me the money. So what you're saying is that it's not that we are inherently bad in our genetics, that Australians cannot write a contract. It's just that we're happy to sell ourselves out.
Yes, we are unsophisticated, and we think about short-termism. You know, if I go back to the China agreement that was done, where we said, well, we'll sell you those, you know, dig them out of the ground and sell them, right? The big corporations in Australia said, whoopee, because of course they could do that quickly and effectively and invested in the mines, et cetera, et cetera. But where was the discussion about the value added? How do we value add? Now, I remember making shows 10 years, 15, 20 years ago when I was talking about the fact that we were giving up effectively the prize by simply digging up the minerals out of the ground and chucking them to somebody else to value add. We now buy most of our building materials from overseas. We don't hold refining capacity in Australia. We have an oil strategic reserve in the US of all places. And we have an investment to build a Western Australian port for US submarines to come visit. It shows that there is no seriousness amongst those in power other than get through the next election and sign those deals, right? And be seen to be doing things, but they're not strategically the right things for Australia. And on that front, I want to just talk about AUKUS for a bit, because AUKUS is another great example of stupidity like you wouldn't believe, right? This is the AUKUS picture that was announced when you had the old Biden, Rishi, you know, Albo, you know, talking about AUKUS and how great it was going to be, etc. We're going to actually make these subs. Now, I made a show some time ago posing the question, is the AUKUS stupidity about to be called out? And as Malcolm Turnbull said at the time, the UK is conducting a review of AUKUS, the US Department of Defence, now Department of War, is conducting a review of AUKUS, but Australia, which is the most at stake, has no review. Our parliament to date has been the least curious and least informed. Time to wake up, which is exactly right. And of course, we saw this with, you know, those two people talking about this again. And there was an article saying, here comes Trump's AUKUS shakedown. The Trump administration's AUKUS review set off a political storm, but it doesn't mean the deal is dead. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But this is the key thing. Most of the debate today is missing the point. The US can comply with the AUKUS deal without transferring any submarines to Australia.
What does that mean?
That means that we are paying a vast amount of money, something like 380 billion, I think is the number over 10 years, right? For the prospect of maybe getting subs. But in the process, we are building a large port facility in Western Australia for US subs to use. And we are actually putting a few Australians into American subs to get experience of driving around in nuclear-powered submarines, nuclear-powered, not nuclear-armed. This is the worst deal ever. But, and this is the point, it goes back to this performative politics point, that picture of those three people saying, you know, we're working together, that's what it was about. It was about performative politics. It was showing, yeah, Australia's on the big stage and we're part of this big thing, right? It's costing us an arm and a leg. And there's a very good chance we won't get anything out of it. That's the truth.
So who benefits from that deal? America,
US.
in the sense that they can park their subs in Australia.
Well, we give them a lot of money. We've already given them millions and millions of dollars, billions of dollars actually. Every few years we give them more money. They are building something like 1.2 of the new submarines each year, right? And they don't have enough for their own needs. And they haven't been able to accelerate. In fact, it's being delayed rather than accelerated. So the chances of getting subs anytime soon. And remember that this was the deal that blew up the earlier deal, which was with the French, I think it was, wasn't it? So we actually wrecked our French relationships for a period of time in the process too. This was Scott Morrison's, I think, was part of the earlier story, I think, too, there as well. This is crazy. We are actually spending huge amounts of money. Now, that money, the 380 billion, or whatever the number is, it's fuzzy, moves around a bit. Think of how much that could actually be going into other things. Now, that's taxpayers' money. That's your money. It's my money. Taxpayers' money going to pay for this stuff, going across to the US. And what do we get in return? A vague promise, maybe, of subs some point in the future. Maybe. And there's been no formal review in Australia of this whole thing. It's a disgrace.
Then the natural question to that is, I think this is what everyone believes, and rightly or wrongly, but if we have these close alliances with the United States, what we get in return is their security. Is that fair to say?
Well, you get submarines, maybe, eventually.
No, beyond that. So it's public knowledge that there's a marine rotation in Darwin. It's public knowledge that there's a close alliance between Australia and America, and it's public knowledge that we're buying nuclear capable or powered subs. I don't see why you couldn't put nuclear warheads in those subs. I don't know anything about them, but they're certainly nuclear powered. Now we won't build nuclear power stations to give ourselves free energy, but we will take nuclear powered subs to go to war. Now, again, I like the idea of powerful submarines. I think submarines are a very capable weapon to defend a island.
Let me pause you there. Did you see that Russia just announced they have been trialling nuclear-powered undersea drones?
Oh, God.
That actually
why not?
Came in the last 24 hours, which are much, much cheaper, right? I would argue that these subs are actually 10 years out of date, right?
Because it takes so long to build it.
Yeah. It's like the drone warfare in Europe has shown us something really, really important about the nature of war, right? It has changed transformationally. If you look at the way that aircraft are now working, the same is true in the sea as well. Now, I agree. It's important to be able to protect your borders, and in Australia we have a big border, and therefore the sea is important. But remember also that there is nothing in the agreement that says you can't use these subs to go and just tap China on the nose.
Well, that's reassuring. When we look at, as an example, IEDs in Afghanistan, so improvised explosive devices, you mentioned drones in Ukraine and Russia. What we can see is, of course, warfare advances so quickly. And sometimes it goes backwards in the sense that IEDs were very primitive, but hugely effective. You could stop armies in their tracks by making IEDs out of mobile phones, discarded water bottles, and a bit of explosive. You could take old Russian mortars and landmines and just modify them to stop an advancing army. And as you mentioned with the drones, you can get drones off the shelf and then make military drones, which can do a lot, and just decimate the enemy. And then when you speak about the submarines, of course, will they be out of date by the time we get them? And this is the forever arms race. But when it goes to the energy, the bit that really gets me that I just don't get is like, okay, we will not build nuclear power plants, even though the rest of the world is. We will not burn coal, even though the rest of the world is. But we will destroy our environment to make these spinning things that are very inefficient. So I know I'm going around a little bit in circles with that, but it just doesn't make sense to me, Martin. I just don't get it. So then it leads into this question here. What's the biggest threat to Australia? Now, you can give a time horizon, 5, 10, 20 years. I wonder what's the biggest threat to Australia. Is it what the mainstream may tell us, that it's China? Is it our own economy? Is it also what the mainstream media tells us, that we're all going to boil to death because, well, when I was a kid, the world was going to freeze. Then when I became an adult, the world's going to boil. So I don't know which way it's going. Well, now, we're not sure, so it's just changing. It's like, well, it was always changing. But, I care about the environment, but which one is it? Is it freezing or is it boiling? And if it's boiling and we don't want to burn fossil fuels, why are you still selling the fossil fuels? And if it's China that's the biggest risk to us, why are they our number one trading partner? And if we don't believe in Trump and the media and the centralized bodies hate Trump so much, why are they celebrating doing deals with him? So what I'm saying is, I see so much hypocrisy. Everything that I'm seeing on the mainstream just seems hypocritical. They say one thing and do another. Let's save the environment, so we're going to sell our coal. All right. Let's criticize Trump, so we're going to celebrate when we have meetings with him. Okay. And I could go on with all of these hypocrisies, but when it comes to the biggest threat to Australia, let me do another one, if I may. We're sorry for invading Australia, so we're going to bring in 1,400 more invaders a day. Now, when I say the invaders, remember, they called us invaders. I'm seventh generation Australian, I think, and I'm still labelled as an invader. I was born here, my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and so forth. And we have to say, look, we are sorry for invading this land. 1,400 more people come in, 1,400. And it's like, well, hang on a second. If we shouldn't have invaded, if we were invading this land and you're saying sorry, well, okay. But again, hypocrisy. Why are you bringing in so many more people? So again, I just see so much hypocrisy. So it goes back to this question. In a 5, 10, 15, 20-year time frame, in your opinion, what's the biggest threat to Australia? Something else or ourselves?
Okay. So I think political ineptitude is probably where we start this conversation, right? The quality of politicians that we have now compared with what we used to have, I think have gone downhill. They've become political ideologues because they've known nothing but politics, most of them. They sort of grow up and go into it. So it's become a job on its own right. That's a problem. The second is that we have to put Australia first, and we're not putting Australia first. We are actually kowtowing to the big corporations and those other entities that we've spoken about, like the US and China, et cetera, et cetera. The third is that we are actually so short term that we don't actually think strategically about where we want to be as a society. And there is no strategic thinking that I can see anywhere within the political machinery in Australia. It's all very short term. In terms of the risks, I think we have to recognize that the climate is certainly changing, and that is partly by the emissions. But of course, those emissions are predominantly now coming from places like China, still going up, and India. The US, of course, is now taken the foot off the brake there as well. But more importantly, it's energy, right? The risk to Australia is effectively not to have sufficient energy in the country to do the things we need to do at a price we can afford. And that's because of the policies that we've made. So I agree with you. I think the nuclear story is one that we should be exploring more than we are. Not the big sort of thing that the previous government tried to convince, or the opposition tried to convince us about. But there are other options there. The energy story is important. The migration story is even more important. We cannot afford to bring more people into the country when the economy is so broken, and where we've got nowhere to house them, we've got no infrastructure to support them. We have messed up royally on that. And then more broadly, standing back, we are going to see that China will continue to rise. It's started on the journey now of encouraging more of its own citizens to buy more. It's exporting more now to Europe and other parts of the world than the US, to the point where what Trump has now recognized is that China doesn't need the US as much as perhaps he thought they did, whereas the US does need China. So that's changing the game a little bit. And then finally, coming back to Australia, right? We have to make Australia great again. I mean, okay, it's a you wouldn't really want to say it too often, but that's really what we need to think about. How do we make Australia great? We don't make Australia great again by just handing more money away to the US or to somewhere else, or just giving away our resources ultra cheap, or paying massive amounts for the energy that we shouldn't be paying massive amounts for. There are things we could be doing that would fundamentally shift the dial and make Australia a much more powerful place than it is today. It's going in the wrong direction. It's falling apart. You see it in the crime. You see it in the social unrest. You see it in the cost of housing. And unfortunately, the sort of superficial reporting that we're getting from the mainstream that everything's fine, we've got this agreement with the US and we're going to do rare earths and everything's lovely. No, it's not fundamentally taking us in the right direction. And that's the problem I've got. So I see lots of concerns, lots of threats. I also believe that we're going to see this polar world mean that we've got to have more people thinking more complex, right? Many other players will want to assert themselves more. India is coming up that curve very fast as well. Other countries too. We've also got a proliferation of unstable leaders who may be more egotistic than previously. That's a problem. And we also have the World Economic Forums and the UN, those guys who still have this doctrinal view of the future to be determined based on digital control and all of those things too. That's another threat too. So there's a lot of threats there. And look, the fact of the matter is, unless we take control of our own destiny, we're going to be this little cork blown around by all those other forces. And I would say that that's what's happened in the last little while for Australia.
Here's the thing. If we can't control our own destiny because the leader isn't in charge, I'm going to keep circling back. Whenever you come onto my channel, you always ask, who is the anchor point? Like, what is the anchor point? Whenever I go onto, when I go on your channel, the question is, what is the anchor point? When you come onto my channel, the question is, who's in charge? and you and I have shared this eternal question on each other's channels repeatedly. You ask, what's the anchor point for money? I say, who's in charge? And in one way or another, it all kind of circles back to itself, because whoever prints the money is in charge and they determine the anchor point, I guess, to an extent. But there's a point here from Mr. Bill, and it's so powerful. He says, has Australia ever made any deals where we never got the short end of the stick? I mean, that's such a good question. Has Australia ever made any deals where we never got the short end of the stick? Now, in your lifetime, Martin, can you think of any deals? It's a powerful question. Has Australia ever negotiated on the global stage where we got a bloody good deal?
I can't recall any of those. There might have been some earlier on, maybe when we had all the sheep and we needed somewhere to, sell the sheep to or wool to, maybe. But no, in the recent history, no, we seem to be out of step, out of position, ineffective in our negotiations. And even the trade deals, if you look in detail at the trade deals, most of the trade deals were actually ending up with us compromising on standards and paying more for things. So no, I don't believe that there's been a great example of good outcomes. And, there have been lots of bad outcomes. I remind you of the recent referendum and how badly that went. Right? We seem to be very good at making bad decisions and going down cul-de-sacs. We seem to be very bad at making good decisions, because this is the key point. We are lacking strategy. We need strategy. There you go. Yes, absolutely right. It hasn't been our strength for decades. We've been dumbed down. Absolutely. There has to be strategy here, and not just politics, right? I think the problem we've got, and maybe it's the social media cycle that's part of this, we seem to be wanting to be doing things in a very short time horizon and to be seen to be doing things. It's that performative politics, but it's not actually getting to the heart of what needs to be done. Australia is a huge and powerful country potentially, but we're letting it go to the dogs at the moment. And neither side of politics really wants to care about it. And that's a problem.
So then it naturally brings us back to, if we don't know who's in charge, it's pretty clear who's in charge, the corporations. And if the politicians aren't in charge, and you say, well, how do you fix it? So let's look at the options. You do nothing and you just, in an option brief, the first option I always write in an option brief is 1, do nothing. That is an option. An option is do nothing. Okay, that's option 1. Option 2 is run for politics so you can be told what to do by the corporations. Okay, well, that doesn't seem to be an option because it makes no difference and you take a pay cut. You take a pay cut to get into politics and they do big hours and they actually work very hard for all the crap that we give them. They believe me, I've seen it.
And then they go off and work for the big corporates that they actually work.
That's right. And let's face it, it's just so that you can get a job with the big corporations. Correct. So option 1, do nothing. Option 2, get into politics so you can get a job for the big corporations. Option 3, get into the big corporations, but then the machine is so big that you're not going to say, right, we're a big corporation, I'm the chair of the big corporation. All of this money that we're milking out of Australia, boy, did we trick them. Look at what they're doing. They're tearing up their earth to sell us their cheap energy, whilst they're tearing up the rest of their earth to put in olden day windmills. Pff, idiots. So we're going to, in this thought experiment, right, as a corporation, we're now going to give back to Australia. Hey, look, we've been taking the piss out of you for too long. Look, stop digging up your earth to sell us your cheap coal and stop digging up your earth to kill all your wildlife to put in old spinny windmills. You just take care of your own energy. So option 3 is not going to work, which leads us to option 4, Martin. And you are, in fact, option 4, where you left. And I'm not saying this in a negative way because I'm considering leaving, and I've had many people on the channel who speak about leaving, the nomad capitalist, Adam Hudson, other people who are vacating. It's just like, go to where you're treated best. And we saw, it was something like, I think it was 140,000, you'll have to check my numbers, but I think it was about 140,000 millionaires left Australia in the last few years. 140,000 people with, now admittedly $1 million is pretty much a house these days. So what's a millionaire? But a millionaire's a scale. I mean, it could be from $1 million to $999 million. So what's a millionaire? So in any case, that's billions of dollars leaving the shores. And if we look at the voter base, the birth rates are so low in Australia that the reality is, if you do the forecasting, white Australians, whether people get upset by this or not, we're actually a dying breed. We won't exist much longer. And in fact, if you do forecasting of white people in total, and I don't care about what color you are, but we should all be valued, I think. But in 200 years, the forecast is that pretty much white people are going to be extinct, and that's fantastic for everyone who hates white people because love inclusion and tolerance. But the reality is you can see this massive demographic shift in the United Kingdom. You can see it in Australia, and you can see it globally where things are moving very quickly. So I bring it back to Australia. We've got 4 options. 1, do nothing. 2, run for politics and achieve nothing except getting a job in the corporate sector. 3, get into the corporate sector and make a lot of money and make no change for Australia. Or 4, leave the country and go to where you're treated best. What do you do?
Yeah, it is important, I think, to say, and I still believe that the political route is not as dead as many people think it is. I do believe that there are a lot of ordinary Australians who are waking up to the fact that the existing system is not working for them. The danger is that you end up with a Trump-like person who can effectively corral that anger and, like Farage in the UK, the Reform Party, is now way ahead of the other parties in the UK. And of course, he has some very extreme views on a number of things. But the truth is, of course, that he may well actually ultimately lead the country somewhere you wouldn't want to be there. So I don't completely discount the political route, because politics is actually about engagement with the community and enabling the community to be able to actually speak. It's just that currently most of the politicians, particularly from the 2 major parties, have their fingers in their ears, and are just chanting whatever they're being told to chant, from whether it's the World Economic Forum or wherever else. But there are other politics out there. There are other parties that actually have a different angle of attack. So don't completely lose that. But I must tell you that the number of conversations that I've had with people who are all saying the same thing: Australia's gone to the dogs. And I can't see any prospect of this turning around. And okay, it's not that there's a perfect place to go to. There are problems in the UK, there's problems in the US, wherever, even in Asia. But it does seem to me that Australia has dug the deepest of holes because of its short-termism, because of the fact that it's corporates who've led the charge, and because our politicians have been so naive and so unable to deal with the real, true questions that we should be tackling. And I actually think that at some point there will be a political force beginning to emerge that perhaps will begin to move. But the question is, will it be too late? How long have we got? Not long, actually. If you look at the numbers and look at what's happening at the moment, this is something that's going to continue to degrade. Quality of life continue to go backwards for many people. But remember this, there are people who are doing really well at the moment. And of course, all the aggregate averages of, income growth, et cetera, is masking the difference between the few percent who are doing really well, especially if you've got stocks and shares and those sorts of things, compared with everybody else. It's the everybody else that I'm worried about, because it's those people that are scrabbling to try and get by day in and day out and are finding it very difficult just to pay the next bill and, all those things. That's what I'm concerned about, because it's those, the majority of people, perhaps 50% in my surveys, who are actually in difficulty. They're the ones that are not actually being catered for at all at the moment, and not being listened to, and are being ignored by the politics that we've got today. So no simple answer to those four options. But of course, there's a fifth one. Perhaps we'd have a big war and that would solve it.
Well, I purposely left that option out because those who are on my channel, they know I often say war is coming. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, what war? A fiscal war, an intelligence war, as in an artificial intelligence war, an energy war, a kinetic war. When I spoke to Patrick Bet-David a while ago, he said, well, war is already here. And he was talking about the fiscal war. And clearly there is a fiscal war that's happening right now. But when you talk about, having hope in politics, where I lost hope in politics was actually with Kevin Rudd. Like, believe it or not, I used to be a fan of him. And I'll just throw this comment in here from Carlos Abibi, because he said it a while ago. He said, Adam, I heard that after the cameras turned off, this was the meeting with Rudd, Albanese and Trump, but with Rudd, the ambassador, sitting directly opposite President Trump at that table. This from Carlos Abibi. Adam, I heard that after the cameras turned off, Rudd apologized to Trump, and Trump's words were, all is forgiven, which I thought was good of Trump. Now, this is all rumor. I cannot substantiate anything I've just read then, but hopefully that was the case. And hopefully, have you heard anything about that?
Well, I just want to say, you got to understand, performative politics is what you do on the camera, right? Not what you do in real life. Yeah, that's part of the problem we've got at the moment. Trump is excellent at playing to the cameras to make the points he wants to make, right? What he says privately could be anything. But which one do you believe? Because they can often be quite different.
Very cool. But in this example, history showed that, if you remember, and we've spoken about it before, when Kevin Rudd tried to put a super tax onto the big companies who were pulling all the resources out of the ground, he was sacked.
Yep.
And that's when I lost all faith in Australian politics. That was the moment, and it was years ago. I think it was in like 05 or 06 or something. He said, basically what we're saying, hey, it's our resources. Foreign corporations, you're coming in and digging our resources out of the ground. Look, fair enough, but we want a bigger cut of our resources. And overnight, he was sacked. And what we saw then was that in my opinion, and I can't substantiate this other than it looked pretty obvious, that the lobbyist, the big corporation, said, hey, Labor Party, you better sack that guy right now. Otherwise, we're cutting your funding. And they're like, oh, well, we don't want to lose our funding. Hey, Rudd, you're sacked. And this was to the international viewers. That's the Prime Minister of Australia. We've got this very weird system. And I understand why it was designed. So you can't have absolute power corrupting. Absolutely. But I'd suggest that's what the Senate is for, to an extent. And even, the public opinion, to an extent. But we're manipulated anyway. But it shows it in Australia. And I've said it before and I'll say it again. I don't think you can actually lead in this country, because you're trying to appease the people, you're trying to appease the party, and you're trying to appease the lobbyists. And as we've discussed, the most powerful group in all of that are the lobbyists, because they have the money. And the money will control the narrative, and the money will actually controls the party. And if you look at the one senator who got up and spoke recently about how many contractor passes there were to Parliament House, over, I think it was again, you have to check my numbers, but I think it was about 1,500 contractors who have a pass to get into Parliament House. Now, I don't mean the contractors who clean Parliament House or do the maintenance on the Parliament House. I'm talking about the contractors, the lobbyists, who can just freely walk through the halls of Parliament House and walk straight into ministers' and senators' office to have a discussion about, I don't know, closed door stuff. Whereas you and I, the actual taxpayer, the voters, we can't walk into Parliament House and have a conversation. And even if we book months in advance, we can't do it. And even I, as with some representation on the global stage, when I reach out to politicians, some will talk to me and others will just ignore me, and others will flat out say no. Now, I'm not offended by it. I understand they're busy and they've got lots of requests coming in all the time. But if I were a contractor and a lobbyist and got a pass to go into Parliament House, then allegedly I can approach these politicians one-on-one pretty much any time, provided they're not in the middle of something. And to me, that shows... Look, maybe I'm being a little bit pessimistic here, but I just don't see how our democratic system is working. And therefore we look at, as you mentioned, will there be a breaking point? It's a big setup into this question here, Martin, before we close off. What is the make or break point? Is it the economy collapses? Is it there is a foreign war that we're thrown into and someone takes over Australia, like America and China go to war, then they lose and we lose because, we can't stand up to China? Is it a civil unrest in our own nation? Is it a massive blackout because there's no energy? Is it a famine? Is it a vaccine? What is the breaking point if it were to occur?
Well, I think of all those options, they're all feasible to an extent. The one that I'm most concerned about is the social breakdown. We're already seeing it in areas of Australia at the moment. There are areas in and around Melbourne where people aren't prepared to walk at night now and those sorts of things. It's that lack of social cohesion, which I think is the sort of the early harbinger of more concerns about that. So that's what I'm worried about. And it's the falling apart to the point where there will be certain areas and certain places where people feel comfortable and, that'll be almost sort of ring fenced and you'll be able to live within that environment. But everybody else, forget about it. And that's not the sort of society that I think we should be aspiring to. And, Australia used to be a very balanced society and everyone could have a fair go and things were sort of built in a way that worked. That's all fallen apart now. And we've now got a society that's falling apart. We've got infrastructure falling apart. We've got lack of energy. And we have a future that looks, well, frankly, pretty dim at the same time as our politicians, from a performative politics perspective, are kowtowing to various international players and coming back and saying, yeah, we did a great job. No, they have not done a good job for ordinary Australians. And that's who I'm concerned about. Ordinary Australians, the people who are trying to get by, the mum and dads who are, thinking about, can I afford to have a kid or not? Or people trying to form a household. Average household formations now a decade later than it was going back a couple of decades previously. This is a very, very important point that we're coming to here. At some point, things have to change. But the question is it an easy way or a hard way, right? The easy way is that ultimately the politicians understand that actually ordinary people have had enough and we're actually wanting to see change. The hard way is more, violence and those sorts of things, simply because the system breaks down. At the moment, I'm not sure which of those two routes are the most likely, but I would say, having spoken to a number of politicians and ex-politicians who aspired to make changes from the inside, they failed because the machinery of politics, the machinery of government, and the machinery of influence is just way too strong. And until that gets tackled, I think we're going to spiral on down.
I'm very grateful for your time, Martin, but I'm sorry to say that you've left me, as a good philosopher should, as a bloody good philosopher should, you've left me with more questions than answers. And you saw at the beginning of this interview. Yeah, you've done a good job. And I expected nothing less. So thank you. And I really struggled to, as you saw at the beginning of the interview, I really struggled to form a basis to this. I have so many questions that it's like, well, where do you start? And there's so much happening at once with the economy, with money, with war, with AI, with energy, with social interactions and so forth, and technology. It's all moving so quickly that when I have these type of conversations with a philosopher, with an economist, with a political commentator, it's difficult for me to find a starting point. And to the viewers out there, Martin actually helped me form a starting point to this conversation, because I think you understand me as well, Martin, and I think you can understand where many Australians are. There's so much to take in. It's difficult to know where to start. So I thank you for your patience. I thank you for your time. I thank you for your wisdom. I thank you for your insight, and I thank you for making me, as I said, think more and question more. But I want to finish on a positive note. Can you, my friend, can you give us some hope? Where do we go to from here?
Yeah. So the first point to make is the world is complicated and messy, and there are no simple answers. If there were, they'd have probably been done previously, right? Unfortunately, in the current world that we are actually in, everybody wants the simple answer, the 30-second TLDR, too long, to read. Truth is, reality is actually way more complicated. And sometimes you must engage in that complication. So the first point is, this is a really good example of, we had to go through quite a complicated route to sort of explore some of these things. And we haven't come to a detailed answer at the end of it. But the journey is the point. And that's the one. Second is, and I come back to this because I fundamentally believe it, at the end of the day, Australia is not a political system or an economic system. It's the people of the country. And actually, at the end of the day, you and all those watching this actually do have power if you choose to use it. The question is, are you up to that, right? Because if you are, then things can change. And the third is, and I want to underscore this very importantly, there is always the prospect. The future is genuinely open. There are things that could be done differently if we pushed hard enough. And give you a few examples, right? So how many people, when there's a piece of legislation coming up like for example, the cash story at the moment is up again, and the government has opened another inquiry, the Treasury. It's closing on the 31st of October, and they are suggesting that only a small number of stores should be given a mandate to handle cash, everybody not. Now, there's an opportunity to have a direct influence. Make a submission over the next 24 hours and say, no, cash should be available, must be acceptable in all stores, big or small, across the whole country, right? That's a good example of using your power, because that is the point. Individuals do have power. Unfortunately, many people choose not to use it, either because they don't know how to use it, and maybe your channel and my channel helps people to understand what they can do, or because they don't think it'll make a difference. Well, I would argue you can make a difference. We've already seen that. We saw it in the cash ban. We've seen it in other ones too. We can make a difference, but only if we care enough to actually get involved. And that's my sort of leaving point. Get involved, right? This is not a done deal. This is not, it's all over, folks. No. The future is still genuinely open.
Those are powerful words, and it reminds me again of what Senator Roberts said. He said, democracy, you have to be involved in democracy. Democracy is not just turning up and voting and then walking away. Democracy is an active process where you hold your leaders accountable. Yeah. And that gave me a lot of hope, hearing that from a senator, to say, and the truth is, Martin, I'd never actually heard that type of insight before, where it's just, wrongly or rightly, I thought, well, democracy is, I get to speak, and once every 4 years I get to vote. And the senator said, no, it's more than that. And it's what you and I did during the cash ban. It's actually standing up and saying, hang on a second, this isn't right. It's not a voting season right now, but I still have a voice and I'm going to exercise it. And I thank you for guiding me through this and guiding Australians through this. And You know, you've done a lot for me. You've done a lot for Australia. I'd suggest you've done a lot for the world. So it's a true honour to know you and work with you. If people want to learn more from you or go to your channel, where do they go?
So I've got a YouTube channel called Walk the World, and there you'll see daily shows on economics, politics, society and philosophy, covering all of these things, not just in Australia, but around the world, because I believe that sharing those ideas can really help to empower people to make, better decisions and grab more. I also have a blog at digitalfinanceanalytics.com, and I'm also on Twitter at DFA Analyst.
I've already left those links below. Go over and support Martin. I really appreciate your time. Martin North, thanks for joining me.
Enjoyed it. Take care.